2003, medics in New Jersey were perplexed. Patients under their care were becoming gravely unwell, with no logical explanation.
Nurses were noticing that their patients were mysteriously crashing. Strange things were happening.
When the alarm was raised, investigators quickly came to a horrifying conclusion.
When you have cases of high digoxin levels, with low blood sugar, with high potassium, with no explanation, you have to think somebody is doing this on purpose.
The investigation zoned in on experienced nurse Charles Cullen, but detectives faced an uphill struggle to stop him.
At that point, the chase was on to try and stop Charles Cullen from killing again, from killing more.
It would take the help of Charles Cullen's best friend to finally bring him to justice.
So I said, I'm going to get him, and I'm going to get a confession out of him, and I did.
How many patients have you helped to their death?
Possibly 30 to 40 patients.
Suspected of murdering as many as 400 patients over a 16-year career of killing, Charles Cullen was finally exposed as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that shocked America. Experienced nurse Charles Cullen had moved from hospital to hospital without suspicion, leaving a trail of death behind him.
From place to place where he went, strange things would happen. No matter what happened, they tended to let him go. And each time he basically resigned, so this way he could move on to another job.
Author Charles Graeber met with Cullen behind bars and delved inside the mind of the callous murderer.
He's a serial killer on a massive scale. Someone who was given the trust of the public to protect the most vulnerable amongst us, to protect our loved ones, to care for them. And he violated that trust in the most horrific manner. And he sat coolly by as they suffered horrible deaths. And that is surely a raw sort of evil.
This killer's story begins on the East Coast of the United States.
Charlie Cullen was born in New Jersey in West Orange, February 22nd, 1960. West Orange was a bit of a rough area. It was a bit of a poor area in an otherwise affluent area of New Jersey. He had 8 brothers and sisters and was the youngest of the family, a sort of late life mistake.
On the 17th of September 1960, when Charles Cullen was only 7 months old, his father died at the age of 56.
His mother struggled desperately to keep the family going and together. They existed on almost nothing, welfare checks and charity and handouts.
Young Charles Cullen struggled to deal with his environment.
At the age of 9, horrifyingly, tried to commit suicide by drinking part of a chemistry set. He was a deeply, deeply disturbed child.
Cullen was possibly predisposed towards personality disorder. And if you put that into that unstable background, that can have catastrophic effects.
The troubled child also sought revenge for how he and his family were being treated.
One of his sisters was pregnant. The boyfriend would come around quite often, and he was abusive to Charlie. He beat his girlfriend, Charlie's sister, relentlessly to the point of miscarriage. And Charlie tried to poison him with eye drops in his drink.
The one person that Cullen seemed closest to was his mother. But on the 6th of December 1977, tragedy struck.
His mother, Florence, was killed when he was 17.
She died in a car accident with his sister behind the wheel. She had a seizure, and his mom ended up dead.
Cullen made his way to Mountainside Hospital in nearby Montclair in the hope of seeing his mother.
By the time he went to the hospital, they'd already taken her body away. And he never forgave the hospital for doing that, for not allowing him to see his mother, for somehow stealing his mother from him. And that is a theme, I think, that really resonated through his life, the sense of loss and his sense of grievance with hospitals.
Devastated, Cullen once again attempted to take his own life, but was unsuccessful. He dropped out of high school, and in 1978, the 18-year-old sought a new path in life.
He decided that perhaps he should find a family, and the family he chose was the US Navy. He enrolled, enlisted, and indeed was sent to work on a submarine, the USS Woodrow Wilson.
But the Navy didn't end up being the safe and secure place that Cullen hoped for.
And I think he felt that submarines would be that exciting war movie version of subs and life aboard. But really, the submarine life couldn't have suited Charlie Cullen any less. He was trapped in a metal tube for months at a time with the sort of guys that would give him a hard time in high school.
Cullen complained that he was bullied in the Navy. He would have been a little bit of an outsider. He wouldn't have mixed well, made friends. If he's got that victim mentality, he's going to perceive any kind of rejection as bullying.
On the 30th of March 1984, the Navy released Charles Cullen from service.
They didn't give him a dishonorable discharge. It's essentially neutral references, you might say. And then he went home to West Orange, where he started working in a department store as a clerk without any real sense of purpose.
Life as a store clerk didn't appear to suit Cullen, and soon the 24-year-old decided to embark on a surprising career path.
Charlie Cullen ended up going to nursing school, and the place he chose to go was Mountainside. So the place where he lost his mother was the very same place he started his career.
In 1984, it wasn't normal for men to sign up for nursing. Perhaps he thought in a female profession there would be less bullying, or he would be in a group of people who would be more supportive of him, and he would have more power.
June 1987 was a busy month for Charles Cullen. The 27-year-old graduated from nursing school, got married after a whirlwind romance, and started his first nursing job in Livingston, New Jersey.
He actually cut their honeymoon short so that he could start work at the St. Barnabas Hospital burn unit. And Cullen's job was to essentially scrub dead, dying skin off of burn victims so that they could grow new skin. And it's a horrific job for anyone, especially someone fresh out of nursing school.
In June of 1988, 72-year-old Judge John Yengo had been admitted to St. Barnabas with severe sunburn and was under Cullen's care. Judge Yengo was hooked up to an intravenous drip and given treatment, but unfortunately didn't make it. Over the coming years, the hospital faced a worrying trend.
Nurses on staff were noticing that their patients were mysteriously crashing, and it was happening with great frequency. Patients would be prepared for surgery, have an IV bag hung, and all of a sudden they'd become incredibly sick. They were essentially instant hypoglycemics.
As nurses disconnected the IV bags, the patient's condition would immediately start to improve. Staff at the hospital were perplexed about why this was happening.
They started examining the bags, and they found that some of them had tiny pinpricks, as if they'd been injected with something. And then they tested those bags, and they found that they were supposed to just contain saline solution, but instead they also had insulin in there. In fact, a lethal dose of insulin.
Staff at the hospital were faced with a horrifying situation. Was there an innocent explanation about how this had happened, or was something more sinister afoot? It was a terrifying prospect, but there was a real possibility that someone who was charged with caring for patients was actually trying to kill them. By January 1992, investigators at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, were at a loss as to how so many IV bags had been lethally contaminated. 31-year-old Charles Cullen was interviewed as part of the investigation.
He was a participant as a nurse who was often offering his services, going fixing the IVs.
Cullen was unhappy that he'd been spoken to about the situation, and he left St. Barnabas Hospital. The following month, Cullen secured a new job in nearby Phillipsburg, New Jersey.
He just goes down the road to another hospital where he's quickly hired. There's a nursing shortage, and his recommendations are neutral or positive at this point. There's no reason not to hire him.
Cullen was working on a ward in August 1993 when a 91-year-old woman was admitted.
A patient named Helen Dean. She was on the ward, but she wasn't his patient. Helen Dean's adult son, Larry, would visit with his mom quite frequently. He remembers being at her bedside when a nurse he hadn't seen before entered the room. And this nurse said he had to do something with Larry's mother. Could he please leave the room? Larry came back in a bit later, and his mother said, "He stuck me." And Larry took out his little microscope on his Swiss Army knife and could see a little pinprick on her leg.
Larry left the hospital, but before he could return, his mother had died. He mentioned to staff about the pinprick.
And they started an investigation and then tested Helen Dean's blood. And they tested for dozens of drugs that might have killed her, and they found nothing in her system because the one drug they, for some reason, did not test for was digoxin.
Digoxin belongs to a class of drugs called cardiac glycosides. These drugs increase the force of the heart, and it is also thought to do something else with the electrical activity of the heart, which will slow down the heart rate.
Larry was convinced that something untoward had happened to his mother, but the hospital couldn't find evidence to back this up.
In that investigation of Helen Dean's death, Cullen and another two nurses were asked to take lie detector tests. Well, Cullen passed. There was no sign that he'd done anything.
Away from work, Cullen, now the father of two daughters, had started drinking heavily, and his wife had had enough of his unpredictable behavior. In January 1993, she ended their marriage. Cullen's life was spiraling out of control, and he was soon in trouble with the police.
He was arrested for stalking the house of a colleague, a nurse and her son. He was found to have gone into the house while they were both asleep.
Investigators charged Cullen with trespassing rather than stalking, to which he pleaded guilty. He was given a year's probation.
Charlie Cullen attempts suicide a few more times. He's in and out of mental institutions. And this is a pattern that continues for the next 5-6 years. He moves hospital to hospital. Each time he starts off as a great nurse. Everything's fantastic. He's an ideal hire. He is the good nurse.
But no matter where Charles Cullen went, death seemed to follow him. By November 1998, the 38-year-old had started another new role, this time at Eastern Hospital in Pennsylvania. The following month, 78-year-old Otto Schramm was admitted.
Mr. Stram was an older man. He wasn't doing particularly well. His daughter would visit quite regularly and was especially surprised then when a nurse she hadn't seen before asked her to leave the room. And the next day when she came in, her father was dead.
It was time for the transient nurse to move on again, and by June 2000, 40-year-old Charles Cullen had started working at yet another hospital, St. Luke's in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
It was a particularly prestigious job. It was a well-paid job. He started off as a nurse that everyone was glad to have available to them. He worked nights and weekends. He would take other people's shifts. He was always happy to help out.
On one overnight shift, 2 nurses observed Cullen going into a closet where medicines were being kept. Cullen left the room a few minutes later, and the nurses walked in.
They found that the fully stocked shelves of medicine, many of them had been thrown away.
Another nurse was going to dispose of a used needle in a sharps box, but found it full of vials of drugs to treat heart and blood pressure.
The nurse reported Cullen to the hospital officials, but rather than face an investigation, Cullen decided to resign.
After a brief 2-week stint at another hospital where he didn't get on with his colleagues, Cullen found a job in September 2002 at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey.
He begins to make friends there. He falls in with 2 other nurses, Amy and Donna.
Amy and I were very close, as well as Charles. We were called the 3 Musketeers, and we loved working together.
He was just a friendly guy, little bit shy, little bit reserved, but he was someone that I knew that I was going to be able to bond with quickly.
Charlie Cullen really leaned into that relationship, a mothering relationship, and so she took him under her wing and protected him from the world.
We were fast friends and became very close. I trusted him, and we trusted each other. We had a really, really good trusting relationship.
Cullen worked alongside Donna and Amy in the intensive care unit, where code blues were a regular occurrence on shift.
Code blue is a resuscitation. So when someone stops breathing or their heart stops or they go into a dangerous dysrhythmia that is life-threatening, we start CPR, we start giving medications. We do everything possible to save their lives.
We were a team, and if an emergency was going on, or if you needed to act quickly with a patient, and other nurses would just jump in and help you.
It was on one such night when a patient began to crash in front of Cullen and his colleagues.
There was one particular patient that had started to code and was in a certain dysrhythmia, and Charlie was in the room when I arrived. He had given a medication called lidocaine. And I remember thinking, why would you be giving lidocaine?
Lidocaine was an older medication that was no longer used for particular dysrhythmias. As the patient passed away, a doctor arrived on the ward wanting to know who'd given them the outdated drug.
Because I was the code leader, I needed to take responsibility for it. And I said, I gave lidocaine. And he said, that patient is allergic to lidocaine. And I just trusted Charlie because he's so brilliant. I trusted that there must have been a reason why he had given that medication.
The 3 friends continued to support each other through the good times and the bad. At one point during their shifts together, Amy was shocked by blood test results from patients in her unit.
There were lab results that were coming back that were blood sugars that were too low, digoxin levels that were too high.
And we thought, oh my gosh, there must be something going on with the lab, because this lab work is just crazy.
One of the patients showing high levels of digoxin was being looked after by Donna.
They actually questioned me about thinking, did I give the wrong dose, or trying to figure out like exactly what happened. But I always would check with another nurse just to make sure I was giving the right dose, just because I know it's a dangerous medication, because people's lives are in your hands and you can kill them. So you really have to know what you're doing.
We really thought that there was something wrong with the lab, or there was something wrong with the pharmacy. We just thought something was malfunctioning.
But it soon became clear that the lab results were in fact accurate.
As we get into 2003 at Somerset Medical Centre, more and more sudden, unexpected deaths take place.
In June 2003, one of the nurses from Somerset contacted the New Jersey Poison Control Center with a concern. The nurse had a query about digoxin levels in a patient who was no longer taking the cardiac drug. Poison expert Bruce Ruck took the call.
At that point, the only explanation that we had as a team was that somebody accidentally gave the patient the wrong medication. And all we are thinking at this point is medication error.
But 2 weeks later, a pharmacist at the same hospital called the Poison Control Center with similar concerns.
And I said to the pharmacist, do you have any patients that have hypoglycemia, low glucose, blood sugar? Do you have any patients with very high potassiums and some other things? And then there was the dead silence. And the answer, yes. And that's when I said, it sounds like you have a police matter on your hands.
There was no doubt in Bruce Ruck's mind that something sinister was going on, and that somebody was deliberately harming vulnerable patients. The hospital was told to find out who was responsible before any more patients wound up dead. In the summer of 2003, Bruce Ruck from the New Jersey Poison Control Center knew that time was of the essence to find out who was poisoning patients at Somerset Medical Center. Bruce sat down with some of their top team, but he wasn't met with the expected response.
They were doing a lot of yelling and screaming at us. And there was a lot of discussion on their end that we should mind our business.
Bruce explained the severity of the situation.
And we said, when you have patients who have 2 cases of high digoxin levels with no clear explanation, patients with low blood sugar, with high potassium, you have to think somebody is doing this on purpose. Somebody really needs to investigate it.
It must have come as a frightful shock to the hospital authorities. Do you mean we've actually been employing someone who's interested in killing our patients and not helping them to live? It's a very difficult thing to take on board.
On the advice of Bruce Ruck, the police were contacted by the hospital and were told there'd been a number of unexplained medical incidents. 2 detectives were briefed by hospital bosses who told them that their 4-month investigation had been found to be inconclusive. Then, on the 31st of October 2003, seemingly without warning, 43-year-old experienced nurse Charles Cullen was moving on once more.
Charlie was fired absolutely out of the blue. No one could believe it, because here was one of our best nurses being fired.
We just couldn't believe it. We didn't understand it. It didn't make sense.
Cullen told his friends that there was a perfectly good explanation for what had happened. Unopened medication vials had been disposed of, and he had been wrongly blamed for it.
I was just really concerned and really sad for my friend, and I actually told him that I would give him a reference to go to another hospital.
Amy and Donna were devastated that their friend had been treated so unfairly. But there was more turmoil to come.
I came into work, just my regular scheduled shift, and I was told that there's some detectives here that want to ask you some questions. And I was like, why? For what?
With little evidence in relation to the deaths, detectives needed to interview members of the nursing staff who had, so far, been kept in the dark about an investigation taking place.
What the detectives needed now was more. They were trying to talk to all the nurses, one by one, and they were forced to conduct those interviews in the presence of the risk manager, essentially the bosses sitting in on every interview.
I was the last nurse to be interviewed, and I sat down in front of the lead detective.
To Amy's surprise, detectives wanted to know more about her friend and former colleague, Charles Cullen.
I decided I was going to say, this is a witch hunt and this is bullshit. And there's no way that there was anything going on with Charlie Cullen because he was a great nurse.
The risk manager was called away from the interview room unexpectedly, and one of the detectives seized this opportunity to have a more open conversation with Amy. He slid a report across the table, data listing all medication removed by nurses from their dispensing machine, Pyxis.
And I saw Charlie's printouts, what he was actually taking from the Pyxis. There was one particular medication that normally you take out one vial every 2 weeks to reconstitute that particular drip. And one particular night, he took out 12 of those vials. When I saw the evidence, it was absolutely glaring. There was no way around it. I had to accept it. There was no possible way he was taking them out except for sinister purposes. He had been harming patients.
It was a bombshell moment. Amy was now faced with the realization that one of her closest friends may have been killing patients under their joint care.
It was that moment in my life that everything changed. I remember just blanking out. It was like a complete shock to my system.
Detectives explained they didn't have strong enough evidence to arrest Charles Cullen yet. They asked Amy to work alongside them in secret, keeping in touch with Cullen as if nothing was wrong.
They were hoping I could get something out of him to explain what was happening. Even though I knew what had been happening, it was still a betrayal of my friendship, and I was lying to him, and that didn't feel good at all.
At the same time, the body of one of the hospital's recently deceased patients was exhumed. Reverend Florian Gall had died of a massive heart attack earlier that year.
And the coroner found that he had more than enough digoxin in his system to kill him. That was, in fact, the cause of death.
Detectives now had various pieces of evidence linking Cullen to the murders, but nothing solid enough to act upon. Meanwhile, the 43-year-old continued to find employment in the healthcare system.
Charlie had called me out of the blue to tell me that he had gotten a job. He was going to start working, and I called one of the detectives.
Cullen would soon be at a new hospital with many vulnerable patients under his care. The pressure was on to prevent any more deaths.
They said, we need to step this up. To actually put that nail in the coffin, they needed the smoking gun, and that meant getting a confession out of him.
Amy was to wear a wire, hidden microphone, taped to her chest, and meet Cullen in a public place, sit across from a potential serial killer, and get him to confess, with knives and forks on the table and who knows what else going on. It was really terrifying, I think.
On the 12th of December 2003, Amy set off wearing a wire to meet up with Charles Cullen in person, while detectives listened in.
When we first walked into the bar, he hugged me, and I was actually very nervous that he was going to feel the wire that I was wearing. I was really pretty terrified. We talked for 2, maybe 3 hours before I finally had the courage to bring it up. And I said, here's all of these hospitals that have accused you of wrongdoing to patients, and I know you did it.
Amy was hoping for a confession and felt secure in the knowledge that the conversation was being listened to by police who could swoop in and rescue her if things got out of control.
He changed. His voice, his demeanor, his face changed. He became a different person. That's the only way that I can describe it. He wasn't my friend Charlie anymore. He had become someone else, and I believe the murderer was sitting in front of me. He told me he wanted to go down fighting.
Amy continued talking to Charles Cullen, but he was refusing to confess to the murders. Amy even offered to go to the police station with him.
He did not want to go in to see the police. He didn't want his daughters believing that he was that person.
Even in the absence of a confession, detectives made the decision to apprehend Cullen before he could start his new job.
He left the restaurant and they arrested him that night. And I thought it was over. And I thought I would never have to speak to him again.
But Amy's job was far from done. Investigators still needed Cullen to confess to murder on the record. For a second time, Amy would go face-to-face with her friend and former colleague. It was a confrontation with one ultimate goal: get a confession, or Cullen could get away with murder. In December 2003, Charles Cullen was finally in custody. The 43-year-old nurse was linked to a series of murders at various hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
Charles Cullen was arrested and brought to the Somerset jail, where he was held and questioned, and they hoped where he might finally confess. The stakes were extremely high here because in a circumstantial case, if Cullen denied everything, the idea of proving intent wasn't really on the table. You couldn't say that someone had made a medical mistake intentionally without direct evidence of that.
Cullen's former colleague, Amy Loughran, thought her role in the investigation was done, but detectives still needed her help in catching Cullen. On the 14th of December 2003, wearing a wire once more, Amy visited her friend while Cullen was still being held in jail.
I talked to him about how he could be the hero, and there was a concern that I would be pulled into a trial and that his daughters would be raked through the mud as well in a trial.
The threat of friends and family having to face such an ordeal seemed to be the trigger needed for Cullen to start admitting to what he'd done.
He confessed that he had injected one particular patient with digoxin to kill him. He was an elderly gentleman, but he was on his way out of the ICU. He was getting much better. And over again, his digoxin levels were going up, and no one could understand it.
That patient was Reverend Florian Gall, whose health had been improving before Cullen ended his life early. The game was up. The 43-year-old nurse decided to formally confess to detectives.
My intent was to decrease suffering in people I saw throughout my career. I believed that my actions would not cause them pain and suffering.
It's the beginnings of the floodgates opening and revealing to the world that Charles Cullen, the man who was later to be called the good nurse, had actually been exactly the reverse, the evil nurse. Cullen steadily admitted killing after killing after killing, in a career stretching 16 years in Pennsylvania and New Jersey.
How many patients have you helped to their death as a result of your actions?
Possibly 30 to 40 patients.
Okay, 30 to 40 patients in total?
Amy called me and she said, Charles is killing people. And I asked her to repeat it because I couldn't believe what she was saying. And I remember just crouching down on my kitchen floor and just sobbing. And I just kept saying, no, he didn't. And when she stopped answering me, it was her silence. Sorry. It was her silence. And it spoke much louder than her words. You know, you always want to look for the good in people. You just don't want to believe that someone could actually do something like this.
Has everything you said been the truth throughout this entire many hours that we've been speaking?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, I've given as clear a picture as I can. There's a lot of fuzzy areas.
On the 15th of December 2003, Charles Cullen was finally charged with murder. He would go on to admit to many more murders across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, including 91-year-old Helen Dean and his first victim, Judge John Yengo, back in 1988. Prosecutors from the different jurisdictions met to discuss the case. Judge John Morganelli was then the district attorney for Northampton County.
We were able to find out when he worked and then look at the deaths that occurred at Easton Hospital during the times that he was on shift, and then look at those folks and then whittle it down. Was he working? Would he have a contact with this person?
One death in particular stood out from Cullen's time at Easton Hospital in 1998. 78-year-old Otto Schramm.
We were able to establish that the digoxin, which was present in Otto Schramm in excessive amounts, probably was a contributing factor to his death.
The case was looked at and the decision was made to charge Cullen for Otto's murder. Prosecutors from all of the jurisdictions needed Cullen's cooperation to help identify other victims. A plea deal was suggested.
Cullen would cooperate with identifying his victims if he could, and was acknowledging that he was involved in many more deaths than we even knew about, with the understanding that all of the prosecutors would not pursue a death sentence.
In total, Cullen pleaded guilty to murdering 29 people over 16 years, 22 people in New Jersey and 7 in Pennsylvania. He also pled guilty to 6 attempted murder charges.
Your Honor, I don't wish to be represented. I don't intend to contest the charges. I plan to plead guilty.
On the 2nd of March 2006, 46-year-old Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences in New Jersey.
He sat with his eyes down, just really to avoid the family members of his victims as they told him what a nasty piece of work he was.
He treated them horribly, would not look at them, would not acknowledge them. He was not remorseful at all. That was not my friend Charlie.
A week later, Cullen appeared in court in Pennsylvania to be sentenced for the murders there.
As the judge spoke, Cullen began to say the same phrase over and over again. He said, Your Honor, you must recuse yourself. Your Honor, you must recuse yourself.
And he repeats it and repeats it for almost 30 minutes until finally the judge directs that he be gagged and bound.
They wheeled him out like Hannibal Lecter, tied together as he's continued to scream all the way out, echoing off the marble halls. It was one of the most horrifying things I've ever witnessed. It was absolutely chilling. That was his last public appearance.
Cullen received a further 8 life sentences for the murders in Pennsylvania, bringing the total to 19. He was sent to Trenton Maximum Security Prison to serve out his sentences.
Cullen will not be eligible for parole until 2388.
He's separated from the other prisoners 24 hours a day, 23 hours in his cell, because other prisoners would love to kill him.
As details of Cullen's horrific crimes were revealed, the extent of the horror became apparent. He'd been using other nurses to unknowingly help him end patients' lives.
He was injecting regular bags of fluid that we would all just grab and hang, thinking we're hanging just regular normal saline, and little did we know it would be spiked with whatever he put in there.
That was one of the worst parts. It wasn't just him. He wasn't the person who was harming these people. He made us all accomplices. I know that I was one of those nurses that hung those bags. I know I was. We all were. There's no way he could have known where those bags were going. He didn't just inject these people. He had very sinister motives, and he was a cold-blooded killer.
Charles Cullen wanted people to believe these were mercy killings, that he was simply putting people out of their misery. But this was proven false.
He tried to explain his actions, that these were people that were terminal, and yet these were people that did not consent to having their lives terminated, and many of them were not terminal.
Despite Cullen's many confessions and convictions, it's impossible to know just how many people died at the hands of the callous killer, masquerading as a kindly nurse.
At St. Barnabas Medical Center, where Cullen started his career, he confessed to killing 4 or 5 people there a week. He was there for 5 years. Charlie Cullen's body count, if accurate, even 400 is probably a low estimate, would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history.
I had no idea the amount of people he murdered and how many families were involved in that. I can't even tell you how much it affected me. I just wish that I could tell all of the families how sorry I am that I didn't see it sooner. He was right in front of me. He was right in front of me.
The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the pine trees, whispering secrets into the forest outside Eugene, Oregon. On a lonely stretch of highway, a single car sat abandoned by the shoulder engine, cold door, slightly ajar headlights, still faintly glowing against the mist. Inside, a child's stuffed rabbit lay on the passenger seat, soaked from the drizzle. The woman who owned that car was gone, and for 22 years nobody could explain why. Her name was Rachel Moore, 34, mother of 2, a nurse who worked the night shift at Sacred Heart Hospital. On a damp evening in November 2001, she finished her shift, clocked out at 11:47 p.m., waved goodbye to the security guard, and vanished into the dark. The next morning, her husband reported her missing. Detectives found her car less than a mile from her usual route home, purse still inside cell phone on the floorboard, keys in the ignition. No sign of a struggle. No footprints. Just rain washing away whatever truth had been there hours earlier. The town of Creswell, small and quiet, woke to headlines that felt impossible. Local nurse missing after night shift. The image of Rachel smiling in her scrubs was suddenly everywhere on lampposts, diner windows, the front page of The Register Guard. She had no enemies, no debts, no reason to run. Yet she was gone. The police scoured nearby rivers and forests. Helicopters combed the valleys, and volunteers with flashlights walked shoulder to shoulder through the mud. But there was nothing. No body. No witness. Only silence. Weeks passed. Rumors began to swirl, whispers that Rachel had been seen at a gas station near Medford. Others claiming she had left her husband for another man. Every new lead crumbled within days. By Christmas, the search had turned into an echo of itself. The same questions, the same pain. And then came the letter. In January 2002, Rachel's husband, David Moore, received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in blue ink: "She's where the water runs cold." Detectives traced the handwriting to no one. The phrase poetic haunting became a cruel legend in Creswell. The water runs cold. The Mackenzie River cuts through the valley, icy and relentless, but divers found no trace. The case went cold, filed away under a stack of unsolved disappearances where it gathered dust for over 2 decades. But time has a strange way of pulling secrets back to the surface. In the spring of 2023, a new generation of detectives at the Lane County Sheriff's Office reopened Rachel's file. A retired investigator had sent a note before he died, a reminder of something that never sat right. A fragment of mud, scraped from the inside of Rachel's car door, sealed in an evidence bag since 2001. Back then, DNA testing couldn't read it. Now it could. When the sample was run through the new genetic database, it matched a name the department hadn't seen before: Daniel Price, a former volunteer firefighter from a neighboring town. Price had no record, no connection to Rachel on paper, but the DNA didn't lie. Detectives began to pull the threads. They found that Price had volunteered in the early search efforts for Rachel back in 2001. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with David Moore, combing through the woods, handing out flyers with Rachel's face on them. In the background of one old news photo there, he was head-bowed, flashlight in hand, a man hiding in plain sight. When detectives visited his home in 2023, they found something chilling. In his garage, tucked in a dusty box marked "Tools," was a driver's license belonging to Rachel Moore. The edges were warped, the photo faded, but it was hers. And beneath it, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a small golden locket engraved with the letter R. Inside, a picture of Rachel's 2 children. The arrest came quietly. Price, now 61, didn't resist. Neighbors described him as kind, quiet, always ready to help. He mowed lawns for widows, shoveled driveways in the winter. Nobody suspected the man who lived alone in the little blue house at the edge of town. But as the interrogation began, a different picture emerged. Price had been stationed at a firehouse near Rachel's route home. He admitted he recognized her, said she'd once offered him coffee during a late-night emergency shift at the hospital. A casual kindness he never forgot. But when detectives pressed him about the night she vanished, he said something strange. "I followed her because she looked sad." The room went still. The details he offered were fragmented, like shards of broken glass. He said he saw her pull over that night near the bridge over the Mackenzie River. He stopped too, said she wanted to talk. When asked about the locket, he went silent. When asked about the letter, "She's where the water runs cold," he laughed. I never wrote that he said eyes fixed on the table. But she liked that phrase. She said it once. Detectives didn't believe him. They pressed harder, showing him the forensic results, the dirt sample, the DNA. Finally, he muttered, "She shouldn't have told me." Told him what? They never got a clear answer. The confession was incomplete, fragmented, but enough to issue formal charges, murder, kidnapping, obstruction. Still without a body, it was a fragile case. Then came one final twist. As part of the new evidence, sweep cadaver dogs were sent to an unused water treatment plant on the outskirts of town, a facility where Price had worked part-time in the early 2000s. Behind the plant, buried beneath a collapsed drainage pipe, investigators found fragments of clothing and bone. The dental records confirmed what many had stopped believing they'd ever hear it, was Rachel Moore. The town that had lived 2 decades in uncertainty now stood still. News cameras swarmed the quiet streets of Creswell, the headline flashing across national broadcasts, "Oregon cold case solved, missing mother's secret finally revealed." But even as justice seemed within reach, questions began to surface, deeper, darker questions. Because tucked in Rachel's recovered locket behind the faded photo, detectives found a folded piece of paper, worn and stained, but still legible. 4 words written in her handwriting: "Forgive me for this." It changed everything. Had Rachel planned to leave that night? Was Price the predator everyone thought? Or a man caught in something larger, something the investigation had missed entirely? The locket note ignited a new storm of speculation. Her husband refused interviews. Her children, now grown, asked for privacy. Detectives combed through old financial records, phone calls, and hospital logs. And in the middle of it all, one new lead emerged, a patient file signed by Rachel. The night she vanished, time-stamped 11:46 p.m., 1 minute before she walked out. The name on that file, Daniel Price. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. He'd been her patient. Why didn't she mention it? Why hide his name? The answers, if they exist, remain sealed in an evidence locker somewhere in Lane County, Oregon. A box filled with faded photographs, brittle paper, and the echo of rain on that highway shoulder where her car once sat. 22 years of silence broken by a single match of DNA and a truth that feels less like closure and more like an open wound. Because even now, detectives admit they don't know what Rachel meant. They don't know what she was asking forgiveness for. And somewhere in those woods where the Mackenzie River still runs cold, the wind still carries that unanswered question, the kind that keeps you awake at night, wondering how well you ever really know the people around you. The morning after Daniel Price's arrest, the Mackenzie River glimmered under a pale sky deceptively calm. News vans lined the narrow road leading to the old water treatment plant. Satellite dishes pointed toward the clouds. Reporters whispered rehearsed lines waiting for the sheriff's statement, but inside the yellow-taped perimeter, detectives moved in silence. Every step through the mud felt heavy, not from rain, but from the weight of a story that refused to end. The remains had confirmed what the town had long feared, yet no one felt closure. If anything, the discovery had deepened the unease. Rachel Moore was dead, yes, but the circumstances were all wrong. The locket. The note inside. The fact that Daniel Price's name appeared on a patient file from the night she disappeared. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was a thread connecting 2 lives that should never have crossed. Detective Elena Carter, the lead investigator in the reopened case, had spent months dissecting Rachel's final hours. She'd seen the photographs, the autopsy fragments, the crime scene reconstruction, but what unsettled her most was the tone of Rachel's handwriting. Small, neat, deliberate. Forgive me for this. It didn't read like a cry for help. It read like a decision. By noon, the forensics team had finished excavating the site. Beneath layers of soil, they uncovered pieces of Rachel's clothing, a nurse's jacket, shredded but identifiable by the hospital's faded logo. There was also a wristwatch, its glass-cracked hands frozen, at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after she left the hospital. 5 minutes before her car was found. Carter knew those minutes were everything. She revisited the surveillance archive from the hospital, grainy black and white footage of the staff parking lot. Rachel's figure appeared at 11:47 p.m., stepping into the rain. Her head down, her movements quick, almost nervous. 2 seconds later, another figure entered the frame. Male tall, wearing a hooded jacket. He didn't approach her. He just stood still, facing the lot as if waiting. The footage ended there. The timestamp matched Daniel Price's badge entry from the firehouse that night. His alibi had always been airtight. He'd clocked in for a late training session. But the re-examination showed something different. The entry time was 11:20 p.m., yet the GPS on his old pager placed him only a mile from the hospital until 11:55. The training session didn't start until midnight. He'd had 35 minutes unaccounted for, just enough time to follow Rachel home. Still, motive remained a ghost. Price's past revealed no violence, no stalking charges, no obsession anyone could recall. When Carter interviewed his former coworkers, they described him as the kind who blends in, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. But one firefighter remembered something odd. After Rachel disappeared, Price had stopped volunteering overnight shifts, said he couldn't stand the sound of running water, the man told her. That detail struck like a blade. In his interrogation, Price never spoke of guilt, only fragments, metaphors, evasions. When Carter replayed the tapes, she noticed how his voice softened when he said Rachel's name. She was tired, he murmured in one recording. She just wanted peace. In another, when asked about the letter sent to David Moore, he smiled faintly. She used to say the river cleans everything. To the press, it sounded like madness. To Carter, it sounded like truth half buried in delusion. The next weeks blurred into sleepless nights. Rain hammered the glass of the sheriff's office as Carter traced every piece of Rachel's life, her patients, her emails, her phone records. A pattern began to emerge. 3 weeks before her disappearance, she'd accessed restricted medical files belonging to a patient under a false name, Daniel Price's cousin, Evan Price, who had died during a hospital intake in 2000. The file had been sealed after a malpractice investigation. Rachel's password had been used to open it again just days before she vanished. The deeper Carter dug, the darker it got. The file contained witness statements, claims that the fire department's response time that night was delayed due to falsified dispatch logs, and the person who had filed that log, Daniel Price. It was motive, not passion, not obsession, fear. Rachel must have discovered something she wasn't meant to see. Perhaps she confronted him. Perhaps that's why he followed her. But the note, "Forgive me, for this didn't fit." If Rachel had uncovered the truth, why would she ask for forgiveness unless she had been involved? Carter couldn't shake the thought. Maybe Rachel had helped falsify those logs. Maybe guilt had driven her to the bridge that night. Maybe Daniel had simply followed to stop her from confessing. At 3 a.m., Carter drove to the Mackenzie Bridge herself. The rain had thinned into mist, and the river shimmered black under her headlights. She parked near the spot where Rachel's car had been found, cut the engine, and stepped into the cold. The air was sharp, metallic, the silence almost too perfect. She walked the length of the bridge, tracing the guardrail with her hand, imagining Rachel's footsteps, the rhythm of her fear. Then something caught her eye, a faint etching on the metal hidden beneath layers of rust. 3 letters, RM. It could have been anyone's initials, or a coincidence, or a whisper from the past refusing to die. Carter stood there until dawn, the river roaring beneath her, knowing this wasn't the end. Back in town, the media had turned the case into spectacle. The River Murder. The Lockett Killer. Cold Case Resurrection. People devoured the story, twisting it into something cinematic, almost mythic. But for the families, Rachel's, Daniel's, it was just ruin in slow motion. David Moore refused to attend the hearings. He hadn't spoken publicly since the discovery. But his daughter Emily, now 28, did. In a trembling voice outside the courthouse, she told reporters, "My mom wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve this. I just want to know why she left us that note." The question echoed through Oregon. Inside the courtroom, Daniel Price sat motionless, his eyes dull, his hands folded. The prosecution presented the DNA, the locket, the fragments of clothing. The defense countered that Rachel's death could have been accidental, that Price had only hidden the evidence out of panic. But then came the bombshell. An analyst from the Oregon State Crime Lab took the stand with new results from the locket. The folded note, "Forgive me for this," had not been written in blue ink as once thought. It was written in blood, Rachel's blood. The courtroom froze. If Rachel had written it herself, she'd been injured before she died. If someone else had written it, it meant the message was staged. Price's eyes flickered for the first time in days. He turned toward the prosecution and whispered something the microphone barely caught. She asked me to. The gallery erupted. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, chaos filled the air. But in that single sentence, something cracked open. What had she asked him to do? To kill her? To hide her? To protect her from something worse? The trial recessed. Amid the noise, the judge's gavel drowned beneath a storm of voices. Carter sat in the back row, her pen frozen above the page. She realized the cold case wasn't about a killer or a victim anymore. It was about a secret buried so deep that even death couldn't silence it. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, and the Mackenzie River swelled with rain. Somewhere in its current lay the truth, distorted, unfinished, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Because in Oregon, the water doesn't just run cold, it remembers. By the time the second week of the trial began, the town had changed. You could feel it in the air like static before a storm. Reporters filled every diner booth, and Creswell locals whispered over coffee, and the courthouse lawn was a maze of cameras and umbrellas. Everyone wanted an ending. Everyone wanted to believe they finally knew what had happened to Rachel Moore. But the truth was starting to twist, to slip between the cracks like the river itself. Detective Elena Carter hadn't slept properly in days. Her office was a battlefield of files and photographs, the walls plastered with Rachel's life. One timeline ran across the corkboard from 1999 to 2023, a thin red string connecting every moment that didn't fit, every lie that went unnoticed. And in the center, taped above her desk, the photograph of Rachel's locket, the one that had broken the case open. She couldn't stop staring at the note. "Forgive me for this," written in blood. Not a smear, not an accident. Each letter precise, intentional, deliberate. Whoever had written it, Rachel or someone else, had wanted to be understood. The problem was no one knew what it meant. The prosecution wanted to paint Daniel Price as a predator. The defense insisted he was a scapegoat, but Carter wasn't sure either side had the whole picture. Something about the tone of that message gnawed at her. It wasn't guilt, it was warning. That night, she met with the crime lab director to review a secondary analysis of the note. The lab's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he slid a folder across the table. "There's something else," he said. Under the top layer of writing, faint impressions like pressure marks from another page written over it. He handed her a sheet of digital enhancement results. The ghost of another message appeared faintly below Rachel's note, written in the same hand, but incomplete. 3 words were legible. It wasn't him. Carter's pulse surged. The implications hit like lightning. Rachel had written 2 notes, one visible, one hidden. One begging forgiveness, one pointing to someone else. She drove straight to the sheriff's office, rain slicing across her windshield. The words echoed in her head. It wasn't him. If Daniel wasn't the one she feared, then who was? Her first instinct was David Moore, the husband who'd found her missing, the man who received the letter, "She's where the water runs cold." He'd been cleared back in 2001, but forensic standards were primitive then, and his grief, though convincing, had always seemed a little too composed. Carter pulled his old interview tapes. David sat straight-backed, his voice calm, his answers precise. He never stumbled, never cried. And in one small moment, one easily missed when the detective at the time asked if Rachel had any reason to leave, he replied, "She wanted to tell the truth." Tell the truth about what? Carter dug deeper into the hospital records. Rachel's access to Evan Price's malpractice file hadn't just been a coincidence. The report showed that the death had been covered up by multiple signatures, including Rachel's supervising physician, Dr. Gregory Hale. A man still practicing medicine in Eugene, still untouchable. The file showed that Evan Price's death had been caused not by natural failure, but by a deliberate overdose, a misadministration of medication logged incorrectly to protect the hospital. Rachel had been the attending nurse. She'd followed orders. And she'd kept quiet for a year, until guilt caught up with her. Carter pieced it together. Rachel had reopened the file to expose the cover-up. She'd planned to come forward. She'd confided in someone, Daniel perhaps, maybe even her husband. But someone else had found out first, someone who couldn't afford to let her speak. Dr. Hale. The thought landed like a blade's edge. She remembered the doctor's name buried in the witness list, an old statement dismissing Rachel's guilt as emotional instability. He'd told investigators that she'd been unwell, exhausted, prone to dramatics. A portrait meant to discredit her before she ever had a voice. Carter requested Hale's phone logs from 2001, and there it was, one call placed to Rachel Moore's hospital extension the night she disappeared. 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes before she left. It was enough to fracture everything. The next day, Carter sat through the court proceedings, her mind miles away. Daniel sat at the defense table, head bowed, unmoving. The prosecutor spoke of violence, of obsession, of power. But Carter was watching his eyes. They weren't defiant. They were hollow. The look of a man who had seen something he couldn't undo. When the session adjourned, she caught him in the hallway, flanked by 2 guards. For a second, their eyes met. She whispered. Rachel left a message under the note. His face didn't move, but something flickered behind his expression. Fear, recognition, maybe even relief. He leaned slightly closer. I told her not to write it, he murmured. But she said someone needed to find her. Find her, Carter asked. She was buried at the plant. He shook his head slowly. Not her body, he said. Her story. Then he was gone, escorted away. Carter stood frozen in the hallway, surrounded by the noise of cameras and footsteps, her mind burning with the phrase, her story. That night, she returned to Rachel's old home, the Moore residence now abandoned for years. With the warrant finally cleared, she walked through the creaking hall's flashlight, sweeping over dust and silence. Children's drawings still hung on the fridge, their colors faded but intact. In the study, she found a locked cabinet. The key was taped beneath a drawer. Inside, a series of folders labeled 2000, 2001, and a stack of handwritten notes. Each one was a confession. Rachel had written everything: the overdose, the falsified records, her fear that the hospital administration was covering it up. And at the bottom of the final page, dated the night of her disappearance, one line stood out. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't fix what we broke. He'll follow me, but don't hate him. I told him where to take me. I just couldn't live with what I did. Carter dropped the paper. The floor tilted beneath her. Rachel hadn't been murdered in cold blood. She had orchestrated her own disappearance, a twisted, tragic attempt at redemption gone wrong. She had led Daniel to the bridge that night, asked him to help her disappear, to fake her death, maybe to expose the truth about the malpractice cover-up. But something had gone terribly wrong. Maybe she slipped. Maybe she changed her mind too late. When Carter returned to the courthouse the next morning, she carried the folder in her hands. The district attorney listened in stunned silence. Everything they'd built the case on, the motive, the anger, the obsession, collapsed under the weight of a new narrative. But it was too late. Daniel Price was already convicted. The public demanded closure, and the system delivered it. The press called it justice. But behind closed doors, Carter knew it was a lie. The real story was darker, heavier, a tragedy tangled in guilt, loyalty, and silence. That night, she stood again at the bridge, the rain whispering against the metal. The water below was endless, merciless. She looked out over the current and whispered, "Forgive me for this." No answer came, only the river's roar. Somewhere downstream, beneath decades of silt and shadow, Rachel Moore's secrets still slept. And in Creswell, Oregon, people locked their doors a little tighter, wondering which stories around them were still unfinished. Because sometimes a cold case isn't solved. Sometimes it just learns how to hide better. Rain fell in waves over Lane County that night, pounding the courthouse roof as if the sky itself were furious. Inside, the air was heavy with aftermath. The trial was over, the cameras had packed up, the public had moved on. Headlines declared, "Closure Oregon cold case solved. Justice after 22 years. But for Detective Elena Carter, there was no satisfaction, no victory. The silence that followed the verdict wasn't peace. It was the sound of something unfinished. Daniel Price was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder, a compromise between outrage and uncertainty. The town exhaled. Reporters moved on to newer tragedies, and the courthouse lights went dark. But Carter stayed behind, standing in the empty hallway, the folder of Rachel's hidden letters clutched in her hand. She'd turned it over to the district attorney, but part of her still felt complicit, like she'd handed over a confession that everyone wanted to ignore. The letters didn't fit the story the public believed. Rachel's words didn't sound like fear of Daniel. They sounded like guilt and resolve. She'd planned her disappearance. She'd chosen the river, but someone had turned her plan into a grave, and Carter couldn't stop asking who. She went home that night to find her answering machine blinking red. One new message. The voice was faint, male, deliberate. Detective Carter, you're looking in the wrong direction. The river didn't kill her. The hospital did. Then click, silence. The number was untraceable. By morning, she was back on the road to Eugene, driving toward Sacred Heart Hospital, the place where Rachel Moore's life had begun to unravel. The building loomed gray against the rain, its glass facade reflecting storm clouds. Carter flashed her badge at reception and asked for Dr. Gregory Hale. The nurse behind the counter froze. Dr. Hale, she repeated. He's not here. He retired last year, moved upstate. Address, Carter asked. The nurse hesitated. You won't find him there, she said quietly. He's in hospice. Hale was dying. 2 hours later, Carter stood in the doorway of a dim hospital room where machines hummed in soft rhythm. The man on the bed looked frail, skeletal. His face sunken, but his eyes still sharp. When he saw her badge, he smiled faintly. I knew someone would come, he rasped. Took you long enough? Carter stepped closer. You knew Rachel Moore. I trained her, he said. She was good. Too good. Too good. She wanted to save everyone, even herself. He coughed a wet, rattling sound that shook his chest. You think Daniel killed her? You think he was the monster? But the truth is simpler, uglier. He gestured toward the bedside drawer, read. Inside the drawer was a faded notebook, pages brittle with age. It was Hale's personal log, not hospital records, but confessions. The last entry, dated November 14th, 2001, stopped Carter cold. Rachel confronted me tonight. She said she'd tell the board what we did. I told her to wait to let me fix it first. She said it was too late, she'd already told someone, said he'd help her disappear. I think she meant Price. I called her husband. He didn't sound surprised. Carter's heart pounded. You called David Moore. Hale nodded. He knew. He always knew. She stared at him. Knew what? That Rachel was going to expose us. The falsified records, the deaths, everything. But she was terrified. Said they'd bury her if she spoke. Maybe she was right. He looked past Carter, his eyes glassy. We all killed her, one way or another. Hours later, Hale was dead. Carter drove back through the storm, the road a blur of rain and disbelief. She replayed the tape of his voice in her head, the confession buried beneath decades of silence. If Hale had called David Moore that night, then everything changed. David wasn't the grieving husband everyone thought. He'd been part of it. Maybe not the killing, but the cover-up. At the sheriff's office, Carter pulled David's phone records from 2001, one outgoing call at 11:50 p.m. the night Rachel vanished, to an unlisted number later traced to the hospital's switchboard. 1 minute later, his wife's car was abandoned by the bridge. She drove to his home, or what was left of it. The Moore house had been sold years ago, but the new owners had left the basement untouched. Dust coated the air as Carter descended the creaking stairs, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The basement smelled of mildew and rust. And then she saw it, a section of floorboards slightly warped, newer than the rest. She pried them up. Beneath the boards lay a metal box sealed with duct tape and age. Inside were hospital ID badges, old photographs, and a single cassette tape labeled RM November 14th. Carter's hands trembled as she fed it into a portable player. Static filled the air. Then Rachel's voice. If you're hearing this, something went wrong. I can't undo what I did at the hospital. They told me to falsify the chart and I did it. Evan Price didn't have to die. I thought I could live with it, but I can't. Greg said he'd fix it, but I know he's lying. David's helping me disappear. He says it's for the kids. I told him Daniel can help. He knows the river better than anyone. If this works, I'll be gone before they realize. If it doesn't, forgive me." Then silence. Carter sat in the dark, every piece of the puzzle falling into place. Rachel's plan had never been murder. It had been escape. David Moore had helped orchestrate it, maybe even staged the disappearance, but something had gone wrong near that bridge. Maybe Rachel slipped. Maybe David panicked. Maybe Daniel was dragged into it as the perfect scapegoat. But why bury the tape? Why hide the evidence that could have freed him? When she confronted the district attorney the next morning, his answer was chillingly simple. "Because closure matters more than truth," he said. The public needed a name. Now they have one. The line echoed in her head long after she left. Closure matters more than truth. A week later, Carter drove out to the prison to see Daniel Price one last time. The guard led her through echoing corridors until they reached the visitation room. He looked older, already worn hollow. When she placed the cassette on the glass between them, his eyes widened. "She told me to hide it," he said softly. "Said the world would twist her story if I didn't. You could have told us." "I tried. No one wanted to listen." He smiled, not bitterly, but with quiet resignation. "They'll sleep easier thinking I did it. That's how people work. They like monsters. It makes them feel safe." Carter didn't answer. The truth had become too heavy to carry. She left the tape with him and walked out into the fading light, the rain easing into a gray hush. The river glimmered in the distance, endless and cold. Months later, when the snow melted and the floodwaters rose, a construction crew found something near the Mackenzie Bridge, a rusted piece of metal lodged in the mud. It was the other half of Rachel's locket. Inside was a photograph of David Moore, his face smiling beside hers. The engraving on the back read, "Till the water runs cold." Carter stood by the riverbank as they lifted it from the silt, the current hissing against the rocks. She realized then what the phrase had always meant. It wasn't a clue. It was a promise, one that had swallowed 3 lives whole. And as dusk fell over Oregon, she whispered the words again, quietly, like a confession carried by the wind. The river doesn't forget. By the spring of the following year, the story had already started to fade. The news cycle had chewed it up and moved on. Another tragedy, boxed and labeled a cold case, solved a name crossed off a list. The town of Creswell began to heal on the surface. The bridge was repaired. The missing posters came down. But underneath the quiet, something was rotting. Because everyone knew deep down the story wasn't finished. Detective Elena Carter still came back to the Mackenzie River every week. It had become a ritual. She'd park near the shoulder where Rachel Moore's car was found and listen to the current. The sound wasn't peaceful. It was restless, as if the water itself wanted to speak but couldn't. The case file sat in her passenger seat. Edges frayed its label, now almost unreadable. Moore Rachel Cold Case 2001-2023. She'd turned it in months ago, closed by the system, buried by bureaucracy. But the truth wouldn't stay buried. Because every time she looked at the folder, she remembered the voice on the tape, Rachel's calm, steady confession, the quiet certainty in her last words. "If this works, I'll be gone before they realize. If it doesn't, forgive me." And it hadn't worked, not the way she planned. The justice system had its villain. The public had its closure. And yet every time Carter tried to sleep, she saw Daniel Price's eyes through the glass, the resignation of a man punished for trying to keep a promise. He'd stopped appealing the verdict, stopped talking to reporters, stopped everything. He'd become what the world wanted him to be, the monster who ended a mother's life beside a river. But the letters, the tape, the notebook, none of it fit that version. In May, an anonymous package arrived at Carter's office. No return address, no note. Inside was a single photograph, a Polaroid, aged and grainy. It showed Rachel Moore standing in front of a cabin near the Mackenzie Valley alive. The timestamp on the photo read November 17th, 2001, 3 days after her official disappearance. Carter's breath froze. She turned the photo over. On the back, in faint handwriting, she stayed longer than she planned. There was no signature. She traced the background, the ridgeline behind the cabin, the angle of the trees, and cross-referenced it with old forestry maps. It matched an abandoned ranger cabin 12 miles upstream near a section of the river no one had searched back then. If the photo was real, it meant Rachel hadn't died that night. Not immediately. Maybe not for days. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not the department, not the DA, not the press. She couldn't. She needed proof, something concrete. That weekend, she hiked to the site alone. The trail was narrow, overgrown, the forest silent except for the wind. When she reached the cabin, it was almost swallowed by moss. The door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air smelled of mold and pine. Old newspapers littered the floor, and near the hearth, beneath a thin layer of ash, she found something that stopped her cold. A single nurse's badge, Rachel Moore, RN. The edges were melted, the name half scorched but unmistakable, and next to it, buried in the ash, a second object, a charred notebook. The same kind of journal Rachel had used for her confessions. Carter turned the brittle pages carefully until one entry caught the light. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. It didn't go how we planned. I wanted to vanish, but he came back. David. He said the police were closing in, that Hale was panicking. He told me to wait here until he fixed it. I shouldn't have trusted him. He left at dawn. He never came back. I heard voices outside last night. I think they found me. The rest of the page was burned away. Carter stood in the silence of the cabin, the realization hitting her like a knife. Rachel hadn't died the night she disappeared. She'd been hunted down days later, and the man who was supposed to protect her, her husband, had led them straight to her. She returned to town with the badge and the notebook, her mind reeling. But when she tried to log them into evidence, she found herself locked out of the system. Her credentials had been revoked. The case, she was told, was no longer hers. The files sealed, her superior said. "It's done, Carter. Let it go. Let it go." 2 words that sounded like a threat. That night, she drove to the Moore residence again. The house was dark, abandoned, foreclosure signs fading in the yard. She broke the lock and went inside. Everything was still dust motes floating in the beam of her flashlight. Upstairs in the master bedroom, she found a box labeled Personal Effects. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small cassette recorder identical to the one she'd found in the basement months earlier. When she pressed play, a voice crackled through the static. "You think you can hide the truth forever?" She wasn't supposed to die, but she couldn't stop herself. She wanted redemption. I wanted survival. Maybe we both got what we deserved. It was David Moore's voice. The tape clicked off. Carter sat there in the dark, the house creaking around her, the river whispering somewhere in the distance. Everything pointed back to him. Not Daniel, not the hospital, not even Rachel's guilt. It was David, the man who had orchestrated the vanishing, betrayed her trust, and then buried the evidence when it went wrong. He'd let another man rot in prison for his sin. But David Moore was gone. He'd disappeared 6 months earlier, before the trial even ended. The official story said he'd moved to Idaho. No one had seen him since. Carter leaned back against the wall, the weight of it pressing down like the rain outside. The truth was finally clear, but what good was truth when everyone else had chosen the lie? She drove back to the bridge one last time. The water below roared wild from spring runoff. She took Rachel's badge from her pocket and held it over the rail, the metal glinting faintly in the moonlight. Then she let it fall. It vanished into the current without a sound. As she stood there, her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, one line. "You're next to the water, aren't you?" Her blood ran cold. She looked around. The road was empty, the forest still. But in the distance beyond the mist, a single pair of headlights blinked once, then went dark. The river rushed louder, swallowing the sound of her breath. She turned toward the trees, her hand hovering near her gun heart, pounding in her throat. The headlights didn't move. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. And then from the darkness, a voice low, steady, almost familiar. "The river remembers everyone who lies to it." Then nothing but the sound of rain. Carter backed away slowly, her pulse hammering, every instinct screaming to run. But part of her couldn't. Because somewhere deep inside, she knew that voice. It was David Moore's. And in that moment, she realized the cold case wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. The town of Creswell was wrapped in a fog so thick it swallowed sound as if the world was holding its breath. Detective Elena Carter hadn't slept. She'd spent the night replaying the message on her phone, that single haunting line. "You're next to the water, aren't you?" The number was unlisted, untraceable. The timestamp placed it less than 5 minutes after she'd been at the bridge. Whoever sent it had been watching her. She drove through town in a daze, the streets empty, the world colorless. Every corner felt unfamiliar now, the diner where reporters used to swarm, the post office where Rachel's flyers once hung, the schoolyard where her children had played. Everything felt touched by that voice. The river remembers everyone who lies to it. By noon, Carter was sitting in her office, the blinds half drawn, the tape recorder on her desk. David Moore's words echoed through the static. She wasn't supposed to die. She'd played it 100 times, dissected every syllable, every breath. There was no mistaking it. It was his voice. But the message was incomplete, like it had been cut from a longer recording. She opened the old case folder again, flipping through each photograph, each police report. Rachel's car, the bridge, the locket, and there, buried beneath a pile of photocopies, something she hadn't noticed before, a photograph taken at the original search site in 2001, a crowd of volunteers' flashlights cutting through the dark. Front and center stood David Moore, and right beside him a man she didn't recognize. Tall, lean, wearing the firefighter's jacket. The back of the photo was labeled Creswell Search Team, November 15th. The name written beneath the unknown man, Mark R. Evans. Carter froze. The name matched the initials carved into the bridge rail, RM. Everyone had assumed it was Rachel's. But what if it wasn't? She ran the name through the system. Evans had been a volunteer firefighter, same unit as Daniel Price, no criminal record, no mention in any of the old reports. But one detail stood out: his death certificate, filed 2 weeks after Rachel's disappearance. Cause of death, accidental drowning, Mackenzie River. Her skin went cold. The autopsy listed the discovery site downstream from the same bridge. Evans's body had been pulled from the river, unrecognizable after days in the current. No DNA test, no fingerprint confirmation, only identified by uniform tags. The case had been closed before anyone asked questions. Carter felt the floor tilt beneath her. What if the body wasn't Evans's at all? What if it had been Rachel's? It would explain everything: the missing days, the charred notebook, the false trail. Maybe Rachel had never made it out of the cabin. Maybe David had swapped the names, a drowning to hide another death. She called the state morgue to request access to the archived remains, but the technician hesitated. "That file's restricted," he said. "Sealed by order of the district attorney's office." "Why?" A pause. "Says here it was reclassified last month. Cause of death changed from accidental to pending investigation. Someone else was already looking." That night, she drove back to the bridge. The fog had thickened again, low and heavy, the air tasting like metal. Her flashlight beam cut through the mist in thin lines. Beneath the bridge, the river whispered, endless, and then she saw it. A flicker of light between the trees. Someone was there. She drew her weapon and stepped off the road, her boots sinking into wet moss. The beam of her light hit the outline of a figure standing perfectly still, watching her. "David!" she called out. Her voice cracked the silence. "I know you're there." The figure didn't move. "I found the tape. I know what you did. You used Daniel. You lied about the night she disappeared. You made sure everyone believed she was dead because you couldn't let her tell the truth." A long pause. Then from the shadows, his voice calm, measured exactly as she remembered. "You think you know the truth, detective. You don't know what Rachel was capable of." Carter took a step closer. "I know she wanted to fix what you broke." He laughed softly, the sound low and hollow. "You think she was innocent? She wasn't trying to expose anyone. She was trying to disappear before they caught her." "Caught her for what?" "She killed him," he said. "Evan Price. It wasn't Hale. It wasn't me. She did it." The words hit like a strike to the chest. He stepped into the beam of her light, older, thinner, but unmistakably him. His face was calm, expressionless, his clothes damp from the mist. "She gave him the wrong dose," he said. "Covered it up for months. And when they started investigating, she panicked. She thought if she vanished, no one could prove it. Hale helped her stage it. I just followed the plan. Carter's throat tightened. You're lying. Am I? He took another step closer. You've seen her letters. You've heard her voice. You really think she was innocent? Carter hesitated. The note, the tape, the blood on the locket. Forgive me for this. Every piece of evidence suddenly twisted, refracted like light in dark water. What if the guilt wasn't symbolic? What if it was literal? He looked past her toward the river. She wanted to go into the water. I begged her not to, but she wouldn't stop. So I helped her. She was gone before I could change my mind. The words hung between them, soft and cruel. Then why frame Daniel? Carter asked. David's expression didn't change because he kept digging. He thought he could save her. He didn't understand that she didn't want saving. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the current below the whisper of water against rock. Then, somewhere behind them, a crack of a twig. Carter spun around, but the road was empty. No movement. No headlights. When she turned back, David was gone. Just mist. Just river. Just the echo of his voice fading into the fog. She called for backup, but by the time officers arrived, there was no trace of him. Only footprints leading to the edge of the river and stopping there. The following morning, the sheriff's office received a call from a fisherman 2 miles downstream. He'd found a body caught against a tangle of branches. Male, late 40s, drowned. David Moore. His wallet was still in his pocket. Inside, a photograph of Rachel, the same one from their wedding day. On the back, written in the same neat, deliberate hand as before. The river keeps its word. Carter stood at the shoreline as the divers pulled him out, the water swirling red around their boots. The case that refused to die had claimed another life. The town would call it closure again. But deep down she knew what the river had become. A graveyard of secrets, swallowing every version of the truth until nothing real was left. She turned to leave her boots sinking into the wet gravel. Behind her, the water churned and hissed, dragging something small and metallic, downstream, a piece of a broken locket glinting in the morning light. And for the first time, Elena Carter whispered the words she'd sworn she'd never say. Maybe the cold cases should stay cold. The day after David Moore's body was found, the rain finally stopped, but the smell of the river lingered everywhere. Damp wood, rotting leaves, iron. Detective Elena Carter couldn't shake it. It followed her through every hallway, clung to her clothes, settled in her hair. The town called it the smell of closure, but to her it smelled like the truth, heavy, unfinished, and impossible to wash off. David's death was ruled an apparent suicide. The official story wrote itself the guilt-stricken husband, haunted by decades of lies, walking into the same river that had taken his wife. The town accepted it. The news anchors smiled through their scripted empathy, but Carter couldn't stop replaying their last conversation, the way his voice didn't tremble, the way he looked at her like a man who already knew what would happen next. It didn't feel like suicide, it felt like punctuation. That morning, Carter sat in the forensics lab staring at the coroner's report. Drowning, no signs of struggle, water in the lungs. But something was wrong. David's watch, the one recovered from his wrist, had stopped at 3:17 a.m. The timestamp on the text message she'd received the night before, 3:19 a.m. He was already dead when he sent it. The realization spread through her chest like ice. She checked the records again. The phone had pinged a cell tower 2 miles north of the bridge near the ranger cabin. The same cabin where she'd found Rachel's burned notebook. She drove there, without calling backup. Not out of recklessness, out of instinct. The kind of instinct that came from knowing the truth wasn't in the courtroom or the files. It was out there, buried beneath the pine needles and mud, waiting. The forest was silent when she arrived. No birds, no wind, only the distant rush of the river. The cabin still leaned against its foundation roof, sagging under moss. But something was different. The door was open. Inside, the air felt wrong, colder, metallic. Her flashlight beam swept over the walls, catching on something new, a fresh set of muddy footprints, large, deliberate pacing patterns. Whoever had been here had stayed for a while. On the hearth beside the charred notebook sat a small wooden box she hadn't seen before. No lock, no label. She lifted the lid. Inside were 3 items: a cracked cell phone, a flash drive, and a hospital ID tag. The tag made her blood run cold. It wasn't Rachel's. It belonged to Dr. Gregory Hale. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Hale was dead. The hospice had certified it themselves. She'd seen the death certificate. But if this was real, someone had been here after his supposed death, someone who had access to his belongings, someone who wanted her to find them. She pocketed the box and drove straight back to the station. By the time she reached her office, the sky was black again. Thunder rolling over the valley. She plugged the flash drive into her computer. A single file appeared, MH_logs_2001. It wasn't a medical record. It was a video. The footage was grainy. Timestamped November 13th, 2001, 10:02 p.m., the hospital hallway. A stretcher being wheeled through the emergency bay. The patient's face, Evan Price, alive, breathing. Rachel Moore was there, pushing the stretcher, her expression blank. Beside her, Dr. Hale scribbled on a clipboard. Then something shifted. The audio picked up a fragment of their conversation. Rachel. His heart's stabilizing. We can save him. Hale. No, we can't. Rachel, but Hale. You want to protect yourself. Follow the chart. The camera jolted. The frame blurred. Hale handed her a syringe. Rachel hesitated. Then a single injection. Evan's body spasmed once. The monitor flatlined. Carter's breath caught. She watched Hale lean down, press 2 fingers to the patient's neck, and whisper something she couldn't hear. Then he looked directly at the camera and smiled. The footage cut to black. For a long time, Carter didn't move. Her hands were trembling, her throat tight. Everything she thought she knew, every version of this story had just imploded. Rachel hadn't been innocent, but she hadn't been alone. Hale had orchestrated everything manipulated. Her guilt made her the instrument of his crime. But the question remained, who had filmed it? Her computer chimed. An incoming email, no sender, no subject, just a single attachment, an audio file labeled, "For you, detective." She hesitated, then clicked play. Voicemail, calm. You're looking for ghosts. Carter, but ghosts don't haunt, the living guilt does. Hale didn't die, he traded names. Check the morgue files. You'll see who's really buried. Then static, then silence. Her stomach dropped. She accessed the state archive remotely, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The hospice log for Gregory Hale showed cremation paperwork filed 2 days after his death, but the witness signatures didn't match. And the medical examiner listed on the document had never existed. Carter felt the world tilt. The man who died in that hospice wasn't Hale. Someone had switched identities. Someone had buried another name in his place. And the only person who could have orchestrated that kind of switch with access to the medical system, to records, to morgue logs, was inside her own department. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the lights in her office flickered. The computer screen went black. Then, for a split second, the image of the river appeared live feed, night vision green water, churning violently. A single figure stood on the bridge motionless. Then the feed cut. Her phone buzzed again, a new text. He's waiting where it all began. She knew what that meant. The bridge. The place where Rachel vanished, where Daniel was condemned, where David drowned. The place the river claimed everyone who came too close. By the time she reached the bridge, it was nearly midnight. The sky had cracked open again, rain falling in sheets. Headlights cut through the fog, a black sedan parked at the shoulder engine running. She stepped out, gun drawn. "Hale!" she shouted. "It's over." A voice answered through the rain, calm, hoarse, almost amused. "You can't stop a story that people want to believe, detective. They need their villains. They already have them. Rachel, David, Daniel, me." He stepped forward, face half lit by the headlights. It was him, older, gaunt, but alive. "The truth doesn't matter," he said. "Only the version that survives." He took another step toward the railing. "You think you're different? You think you're not part of it now." Carter's hand tightened around her gun. "Don't move." He smiled faintly. "You'll see. When they write about you, they'll call it another cold case. That's how it ends." Then he turned and without hesitation stepped over the railing. The water swallowed him whole. Carter ran to the edge, her flashlight slicing through the dark, but the current was already carrying him away. Just like Rachel, just like David, just like all of them. The rain fell harder, blurring everything: the trees, the road, the world itself. She stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the river below. When dawn came, the car was gone. The road was dry. The bridge was empty. No one believed her story. There was no record of the message, no trace of the flash drive, no camera footage. The department called her unstable. They suspended her. But she knew what she saw. She still drives to the bridge sometimes, just before dawn. The fog rolls low over the water. The wind whispers through the trees. And every so often, when the light hits the surface just right, she swears she sees their faces beneath the current. Rachel, David Hale, all staring up at her mouths, moving silently beneath the waves. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's truth. Or maybe the river really does remember. And in Oregon, when it whispers your name, it never stops calling. Carter's suspension was supposed to be temporary, 60 days to rest, reflect, and regain perspective. That was the phrase they used in the official memo printed on government letterhead, signed in black ink by the very people who didn't believe her. But rest wasn't possible anymore. Not when the river still whispered every time she closed her eyes. The first week, she tried to sleep. The second, she stopped pretending. The bridge had become her gravity, pulling her back again and again, like a tide she couldn't escape. By mid-June, she was living out of her car parking along the Mackenzie every night, watching the water shift from silver to black. She wasn't chasing justice anymore. She was chasing understanding. Because now she knew the truth didn't end with Rachel Moore or David or even Dr. Hale. There was something older here, something that had lived beneath the surface long before any of them drowned. One night, near 2 a.m., she woke to a sound. Not wind, not rain. A low hum, mechanical distant. She stepped out into the cold, following the noise along the embankment. Half a mile downstream, she found it a generator, half buried under debris. It was attached to a submersible camera cable, its wire snaking into the water. Someone had been recording the river. She pulled the line, hand over hand, until a waterproof camera surfaced its light still blinking red. She wrapped it in her jacket and took it back to the car. When she connected it to her laptop, the screen filled with murky images, the riverbed filmed from below. Hours of footage, nothing but darkness, silt, and stone. Until one frame caught her breath. A shape, pale, human, not floating standing. She froze. The image enhanced the exposure. It wasn't a body. It was a mannequin, a medical dummy, the kind used in hospital training. But its face was smeared with something dark, its hand clutching a laminated badge. She zoomed closer. The name was visible through the sediment, Elena Carter. Her blood turned to ice. Someone was sending her a message, not just watching her, but replacing her. She copied the footage onto a flash drive and drove straight to the sheriff's office. But when she tried to show it, the file was gone. Corrupted, every frame, nothing but static and hiss. The IT tech shrugged. Maybe water damage, he said. Maybe a glitch. But Carter knew better. Someone had erased it. That night, she returned to her motel room and locked the door. She spread every piece of evidence across the bed, the photographs, the locket, fragment, the burned notebook, the tape. And as the rain began again outside, she saw it, a pattern, one she'd missed before. Every person tied to the case, Rachel David Hale, even Daniel Price, had connections to the hospital's disaster response unit. And all of them had signed on to the same volunteer registry in 2000 Project Mackenzie. She'd seen the name before in one of Hale's files, a medical readiness program, government-funded, local outreach, nothing unusual, at least on paper. But when she ran the project number through the state database, no funding record existed. No grant, no oversight, just a name. Project Mackenzie terminated 2002, the same year Rachel disappeared. She dug deeper using an old clearance code she still remembered from her active badge. Buried in an archive of declassified emergency response plans, she found it a memorandum labeled Contingency Protocol Mackenzie River Test Zone. It described a series of controlled trauma simulations conducted by hospital and fire personnel. Only 6 participants, all sworn to confidentiality, all trained to simulate casualty events. And at the bottom of the list, under lead nurse Rachel Moore. Carter felt her pulse pound. The entire disappearance had begun as an experiment. Rachel hadn't planned to vanish out of guilt. She'd been part of something bigger, a staged emergency exercise gone wrong, a cover-up masquerading as a tragedy. Maybe she'd tried to expose it. Maybe Hale silenced her. Maybe David helped bury it to protect their family. That was the real secret. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number, one message. "You're getting close. Don't look under the floor." Her breath hitched. She glanced down at the motel floor, cheap laminate warped near the edges. Slowly she knelt, pried up one corner with her knife. Beneath the first layer of flooring was another older, darker stain. She peeled it back. There, embedded in this wood, was a name carved by hand, RM. Her chest tightened. She dug deeper splinters, biting her palms until her knife hit metal. A small lockbox bolted between the beams. She forced it open. Inside was a single VHS tape wrapped in plastic, the label smudged but readable, Mackenzie test footage, do not view. Her hands trembled as she fed it into the old VCR on the dresser. The screen crackled to life static, then flickering images of the bridge floodlights and emergency vehicles. It wasn't the aftermath of a crime. It was a drill, a fake rescue operation, complete with volunteers and staged bodies. Rachel was there, soaked, shivering, covered in theatrical blood. Hale stood beside her, clipboard in hand, directing the scene. "Reset," he shouted, again from the top. But something was wrong. In the corner of the frame, another body, real this time, floated against the current. A man screaming off camera, "He's not moving!" The chaos that followed wasn't part of the script. Hale grabbed Rachel's arm, yelling for silence. The camera shook. The sound cut, and the screen went black. When the feed resumed, it was daytime. The river was calm again. The crew was gone. The only thing left on screen was Rachel's empty car parked by the shoulder. Carter sat frozen, every muscle locked. The truth was unthinkable. The Mackenzie River cold case wasn't an accident or a single crime. It was the aftermath of an experiment that spiraled into death, cover-up, and legend. She looked again at the final frame of the tape. Faintly visible on the bridge railing were 3 carved letters. Not RM, but Esther. Mackenzie River. It wasn't a signature, it was a brand. A chill ran through her as the motel lights flickered. She turned and saw movement outside the window, a shadow tall and still, watching. The power cut out. The tape kept playing. The last frame lingered. The bridge rain falling, water rising, and a voice distorted by static. "The river keeps what you feed it, detective." Then silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Carter sat in the dark, realizing something horrifying. This wasn't about Rachel anymore. It never had been. It was about the river. And it was still hungry. By the time dawn crept over the Mackenzie Valley, Carter knew she couldn't go back, not to her department, not to the version of herself that still believed in procedure or truth or closure. Those words meant nothing anymore. What she'd seen on that tape had rewritten everything she thought she understood about the case, about all of them. She played the VHS again as the first light bled through the motel curtains. The same scene, Rachel on the riverbank, the fake rescue Hale shouting orders. But this time, Carter slowed the footage frame by frame, studying every flicker, every reflection. And there it was, in the lower corner, barely visible, another figure watching from the tree line. The timestamp placed it before Hale even arrived. A silhouette, motionless, the face hidden, but the outline unmistakable. Daniel Price. Her stomach twisted. If the exercise had gone wrong, if someone had actually died, maybe Daniel had seen what really happened. Maybe that's why he vanished from the firehouse logs that night. Maybe that's why he'd confessed decades later in fragments and riddles. He'd been carrying the truth buried under guilt he couldn't explain. Carter shut the tape off and grabbed her keys. The rain had started again, thin and cold. She drove north to the correctional facility where Daniel was still serving his sentence. The guard at the gate barely looked up. "You're not cleared for interviews," he said. She handed him the old badge she still kept in her wallet. "You didn't see me," she said. The guard hesitated, then buzzed her through. Daniel sat across from her in the visitation room, the same hollow eyes, the same quiet composure. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the low murmur of distant voices. Finally, Carter slid a photo across the table, a still from the VHS, the figure in the trees. "That's you, isn't it?" He stared at it for several seconds before answering. I thought they destroyed that tape. So you were there. He nodded slowly. They told us it was training, a disaster simulation. Rachel volunteered because she thought it would help fund the hospital's emergency wing. None of us knew what it really was. What was it, Daniel? He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was emotion there. Fear, raw and human. It was a selection, he said quietly. They said the river was unstable, that they were testing rescue protocols, but Hale said the water had to choose. Carter leaned forward. Choose what? He hesitated, glancing around the room, as if the walls could hear. He said some currents don't just flow, they pull. And once you wake that kind of current, it remembers the faces of the ones who disturbed it. Carter felt the back of her neck prickle. You think Hale believed that? I think Hale fed it. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. After the drill went wrong, he told us not to talk, said the river takes witnesses. A week later, one of the divers drowned. Then another. Then the reporter who tried to write about it. He pushed the photo back toward her. You shouldn't have watched that tape. Before she could answer, the guard appeared at the door. Time's up. Carter stood her mind, spinning her pulse, a drumbeat in her ears. Daniel looked up at her one last time. If you go back to that river, he said, you won't come out the same. Outside, the wind had turned violent. Branches whipped across the road as she drove back toward Creswell. Every mile felt heavier. Her phone buzzed once, then went dead. No signal. When she passed the halfway point to the bridge, fog rolled in from the water, thick and fast, swallowing the headlights. And then she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screaming against wet asphalt. The figure didn't move. For a moment, through the fog, she thought she saw Rachel, soaked hair clinging to her face, eyes black and bottomless. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. Only the road, only the sound of rain. She reached the bridge just as the last light faded. The Mackenzie roared below, swollen from the storm. The water reflected flashes of lightning, long pale streaks across its surface. She walked to the center of the bridge, rain dripping from her coat, the wind howling in her ears. This is where it ends, she whispered. But the river answered a low rumble, almost like a voice beneath the current. She shone her flashlight down into the churning water. Something glinted below the surface, not debris, not reflection. Metal. A car. Her breath caught. She climbed over the guardrail, lowering herself toward the embankment. Mud slid under her boots as she scrambled closer to the waterline. When the next flash of lightning hit, she saw it clearly. Rachel Moore's car. The same model, the same color, perfectly preserved its headlights, still faintly glowing as if waiting. Impossible. The recovery team had impounded that car 20 years ago. She'd seen it in the evidence lot herself. The current surged, pulling at her boots. She stepped closer, shining the light through the window. For a second, her own reflection stared back. Then another someone sitting in the driver's seat. Rachel! Her head turned toward Carter, eyes wide open mouth, forming words that the river stole away. Carter stumbled back, heart pounding, the world spinning. She looked again, and the car was gone. The surface of the water smooth, black, empty. She fell to her knees, gasping rain mixing with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Behind her the wind shifted. Footsteps. She turned slowly. At the far end of the bridge, someone was walking toward her. A man in a dark raincoat, hood up steady stride. Dr. Gregory Hale. His voice carried over the wind, soft but clear. You see now, don't you? The river never wanted her. It wanted you. She reached for her weapon, but her hand froze. The gun felt impossibly heavy, her fingers numb. Hale stopped a few feet away, his face pale and dripping eyes hollow. It doesn't end, detective. You opened it. You kept it alive. Lightning split the sky. He was gone. Only the sound of rushing water, louder now, almost a scream. Carter stumbled back toward her car, hands shaking, breath shallow. When she finally managed to start the engine, the headlights flickered once, twice, then illuminated something written across her windshield in streaks of mud. The river knows. She drove until she couldn't see the water anymore, until the road disappeared into forest, and the fog swallowed everything behind her. By the time she reached the next town, she could still hear it, the faint rush of the Mackenzie somewhere far below, following her like a heartbeat she couldn't escape. She checked into a motel under a false name, left her badge on the nightstand, and turned on the shower to drown out the sound. But when she looked into the mirror, the words were there again, traced in condensation across the glass. "Forgive me for this." Her pulse stopped. She stared at the message, the handwriting identical to Rachel's. And for the first time since the beginning, Detective Elena Carter began to wonder, what if the river hadn't taken Rachel or David or Hale? What if it had simply kept them? And what if it was finally coming for her? Carter barely remembered sleeping. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it, the roar of the Mackenzie, deep and guttural, echoing through the walls. The motel clock blinked 3:17 a.m., the same hour David's watch had stopped, the same time the last message had come. She sat up, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around her legs. The mirror still held the words, "Forgive me for this." She'd wiped it clean twice, each time they came back. She turned on the desk lamp and spread the files again. The pattern was complete, now unmistakable. Every person tied to Project Mackenzie had died within a mile of the river, every one except her. She stared at the roster of names, her finger tracing the final line. Participant 7E. Carter. Her throat closed. The project wasn't over. She'd been part of it all along. In the silence, her phone vibrated once. A new email. No sender. Subject line blank. Just a single line in the body. "Meet me where the water first turns dark." She knew where that was. The mouth of the Mackenzie, where the river met the Willamette, a place locals called Dead Run Bend. The drive took 2 hours. Fog hung low, hugging the road. The closer she got, the more her headlights flickered, like the air itself was shorting out. The GPS died half a mile from the bend, the signal swallowed by static. When she reached the clearing, the air was unnaturally still. The river widened here, black glass, stretching into nothing. And in the middle of that emptiness, a single light flickered a lantern on the dock. A figure stood beside it. Daniel Price. He looked older. Thinner, his prison uniform traded for a dark coat. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "You escaped," Carter breathed. "They let me go," he said quietly, "or maybe they sent me." He held up a stack of papers, water-damaged, edges torn. Hale's final notes. "You were always part of it. You were supposed to finish what Rachel started." She stepped closer. What did she start? Daniel's eyes flickered toward the river. She woke it. The wind shifted, carrying a low vibration through the ground like thunder underwater. Hale thought he could measure it, Daniel said. He said the current had memory, that every trauma leaves a residue, and if you mapped it, you could see what the water remembers. He pointed toward the dark. Project Mackenzie wasn't about rescue. It was about resurrection. Carter's voice was barely a whisper. Resurrection. He believed the river could give back what it took. Lightning flashed far away, illuminating the surface for a heartbeat, and there, under the ripples, she saw them. Shapes, faint, human, suspended like reflections trapped under glass. Rachel, David, Hale, all staring up. "They're not dead," Daniel said. "Not exactly. They're part of it now. The current keeps them." Carter's legs felt weak. "Why show me this?" "Because you're next," he said. "You finished the circle. You're the last witness." The ground trembled. The water began to boil, rising higher against the dock. The lantern blew out. "Daniel, we can end this," she shouted. "We can expose it. Tell the world what they did." He shook his head. "You still don't get it. The world already knows. They just chose not to see. Every story you've told, every case you've solved, they all end the same way. People forget. The river doesn't." He stepped backward toward the edge. "It remembers everything we feed it." Daniel stopped. He smiled sadly. "This is how it stays quiet." And then he fell. The splash was deafening, swallowed instantly by the current. The water went still again, smooth and perfect. Carter dropped to her knees, shaking. Her flashlight rolled beam slicing across the dock, catching on a metal object lying where Daniel had stood, his ID tag, and beneath it, carved into the wood, fresh and deep. "Easy, remember me." She pressed her hand to the carving. The wood was warm, too warm. The river rose. Water surged over the dock, ice cold around her boots, climbing fast. She stumbled back, but the current reached higher, curling around her knees, her waist. The noise was deafening now, a chorus of voices, whispers, layered over each other. Rachel's, David's, Daniel's. "You wanted the truth. Now you're part of it." Her flashlight slipped from her hand, sank, and vanished into the black. She gasped, dragging herself toward the shore. The mud gave way beneath her fingers, slick, pulsing as if the ground itself was breathing. Something caught her wrist, a hand, cold, soft, impossible. Rachel's face surfaced inches away, eyes wide, mouth moving soundlessly. Carter screamed, tearing free, crawling through the reeds until she reached dry land. She turned, shaking, staring at the river. It was calm again, perfectly calm. No ripples, no voices, no sign anyone had been there. She sat in the dirt until the sky began to lighten, the first trace of dawn creeping over the horizon. Her phone buzzed once more. No number, one photo attachment. It showed the dock empty clean, but at the center of the frame, carved into the wood in neat letters, Elena Carter missing since 2025. Her pulse froze. She dropped the phone. The sun rose bleeding orange light across the water. For a moment, the river looked almost beautiful. Then, something beneath the surface moved slow, deliberate, following the curve of the current toward her. She stood backing away, step by step, until her heels hit the tree line. And the whisper came again, soft, endless, rippling through the leaves. The river remembers. Then silence. That was 3 days ago. The motel room she rented is still paid through the week. Her car is still parked outside, door open, keys in the ignition. The sheriff's department found her badge on the dock, half buried in silt. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, just water. And when the divers searched the bend, they said the current there was wrong, slower than it should be, as if something underneath was breathing. They closed the case that night. Oregon 2025 cold case detective vanishes river, keeps its secrets. But locals say that on certain nights when the fog drifts low and the moon hits the water just right, you can still hear her voice carried by the current. The rain returned 3 nights after she disappeared. It came in waves, slow, steady, then violent, turning the Mackenzie into a mirror of stormlight and secrets. Search teams combed the banks for a week. Helicopters traced its length from the Cascades to the Willamette. But in the end, there was nothing. No body, no blood. Just her car, her badge, and the whispering water that never told the same story twice. The official report was short. Detective Elena Carter presumed drowned while investigating the 2001 disappearance of nurse Rachel Moore. Another cold case added to the archive. Another name swallowed by the same current that had already claimed too many. The file closed with a single line typed by a clerk who never knew her subject, likely overcome by weather conditions near Mackenzie Bridge. But the locals tell it differently. They say the river turned quiet that night, not calm, but watchful, like it was listening. They say the fog rolled in before dawn and stayed longer than it should have, thick as breath, smothering the valley until every sound became memory. And if you walk the bridge now when the air is still and the mist curls low, you can hear it. A low hum beneath the wind, rhythmic and deliberate, like the echo of a woman's heartbeat. That's where they built the memorial. Not for Rachel, not for David, not for Daniel, for the detective who refused to stop listening. It's small, just a plaque bolted into the railing, half covered by rust and moss. It reads, Elena Carter, 1979-2025. The river remembers. At night, the lantern by the plaque flickers even when there's no wind. Some say it's electrical interference from the power lines. Others say it's her still watching the water, still following the story she never got to finish. Because in the months after her disappearance, the current began giving things back. First, a phone, found lodged beneath a fallen log 10 miles downstream. Inside one recording, faint, distorted Elena's voice drowned beneath the hiss of rain. If this is found, don't open the file. Don't go to the river. It doesn't want witnesses, it wants believers. Then a camera. Pull it from the mud near Dead Run Bend. The footage was unrecoverable except for the final second, the lens half submerged, catching the reflection of a woman's face above the surface. Not Rachel, not Elena, someone else. And finally, the notebook. The same kind Rachel Moore had carried all those years ago. The handwriting was different, sharper, more deliberate, but the words were the same. Forgive me for this. That was the last piece of evidence logged before the state sealed the file for good. The sheriff's office refused interviews. The hospital denied any record of Project Mackenzie. The DA's office ordered the destruction of the remaining tapes, citing psychological contamination of personnel. But the river didn't care. It kept its own archive invisible, shifting alive. Every year, the fog comes back stronger, thick enough to muffle engines and swallow headlights whole. Drivers report voices on the bridge radio static layered with whispers, fragments of a woman's voice saying the same thing again and again. The current keeps what you feed it. No one dares stop anymore. They speed through eyes forward, afraid to look down. Because those who do, they say sometimes see faces beneath the surface pale, watching their mouths moving silently, repeating that same phrase. The Mackenzie became legend, then folklore, then cautionary tale. The river that remembers. The current that eats the past. But somewhere in a dark evidence vault in Lane County, there's still one file that no one touches. It has no index number, no name, just a handwritten label smudged by time. For record, cold case open water. Inside one photograph, a still frame from an unseen video. The bridge, nighttime. Fog rolling low. A lone figure standing at the railing, coat billowing, flashlight in hand. You can't see her face. You don't need to. The timestamp reads 03/17/04, the last minute before she vanished. And in the reflection on the river below, you can see what she was looking at. Dozens of shapes beneath the surface, shifting in perfect rhythm like the pulse of something vast and remembering. Maybe that's the truth about cold cases. They never really close. They just wait buried in silence in water in places that don't forget. Because somewhere beneath Oregon's quiet sky, the Mackenzie still moves slow, endless, patient, carrying the names of everyone it has ever touched. And if you listen long enough, when the night is still and the rain begins again, you can hear them all whispering from the depths. Forgive me for this. Fade to black. Sound of running water. Title card appears. Oregon cold case solved missing mother's secret, finally revealed. The broadcast opens with silence. No music, no static. Just the hiss of wind moving through the valley, the low groan of wood under rain. Then a single sound fades in dripping water. Slow, steady, relentless. Voiceover low, calm, deliberate. They said the river only remembers what we give it, but what if the river remembers more? The screen fades from black to the image of the Mackenzie at dawn. Mist rolls across the surface, pale and heavy. The bridge looms like a scar, its rusted beams bleeding into the fog. A reporter's voice cuts softly through the rain. It's been 1 year since Detective Elena Carter vanished while investigating one of Oregon's most haunting cold cases. Officially, her disappearance remains unsolved, but here along the banks of the Mackenzie River, people say the story never ended. They say she never left. The camera pans slowly to the memorial plaque, its letters damp and glistening. The lantern beside it burns with a weak, trembling flame. Locals step forward to speak. Their faces are half hidden by hoods, their voices low. Sometimes when it rains just right, you can hear her walking. I heard her radio once through the fog, said she found something, then nothing but water. The river doesn't take, it trades. A pause. The sound of rushing water grows louder, deeper, almost alive. The voiceover returns, not the reporter's this time, but Elena Carter's. Archival audio. Words recovered from her last field recording. If this is found, the story doesn't end at the bridge. The bridge was only the surface. The river runs underneath everything, the hospital, the town, all of us. It doesn't just remember us. It recreates us. The footage slows. The image of the water blurs. Beneath the current, faint shapes begin to shift. Faces, pale and soft-edged, flicker just below the surface. Rachel, David, Daniel, Hale. And then, in one fleeting instant, Elena herself, eyes open mouth, moving as if still trying to speak. The screen cuts to black. Then, new footage. Date stamped 2 weeks ago. Night vision, handheld, shaky. A search and rescue volunteer narrates quietly as he walks along the riverbank. We were told to check the flood zones after the last storm. Found a section of bank that collapsed. Looked like bones at first, but they were metal. Dozens of badges' ID tags, all of them corroded. The camera zooms in on the pile of rusted metal glinting in the mud. Police badges, firefighter insignias, hospital IDs, all the names connected to Project Mackenzie. Then, one last tag cleaner than the rest, shining under the flashlight, E. Carter. The cameraman breathes sharply. Jesus, she's one of them. The recording cuts. Back in the studio, the reporter's voice returns tight, uneasy. Authorities deny any connection between the recovered items and the disappearance of Detective Carter. The river's currents, they say, often unearth debris from decades past. Still, residents remain uneasy. The camera fades again to the bridge. The rain intensifies the sound, almost drowning the narration. Every current tells a story. And sometimes, when the water runs cold enough, that story finds its way back to the surface. Lightning cracks for a split second, illuminating the water below. Something moves. Not a wave, not debris. Something swimming against the current. The lantern beside the memorial flickers out. Then faintly from somewhere under the bridge, a woman's voice. Distant, steady, almost tender. Don't forget what we did. The sound fades with the storm. Cut to black. Title card appears in white letters over the echo of Water Oregon cold case, The River That Remembers. Then a second line fades in beneath it, slow and deliberate, the same phrase written in Rachel Moore's handwriting, preserved from that first locket 24 years earlier. Forgive me for this. And as the final echo of her voice fades into the static of the rain, the river begins to hum, not violently this time, but softly, like a lullaby. Somewhere between the mist and the current, something listens. And somewhere deep beneath the water, something finally answers. Fade out. Sound of a heartbeat blending into running water. End of file.